After a month traveling from Central America, close to 200 migrants have arrived at Mexico's border with the United States. Most of them are from Honduras and El Salvador and claim they are running away from violence in their home countries. So far, just a few have been allowed to apply for asylum here in the United States. President Trump says that the caravan is defying the country's border and shows just how ineffective American immigration laws are. To discuss this and other topics, we have on our set Paolo von Schirach. He is the president of the Global Policy Institute. Maria Pena is the senior political correspondent with Opinion, and Morgan Muchnick is a Republican strategist and founder of the M2 Group, a public and government affairs firm. And in our newsroom, just a few yards away, is David Smith, and he is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief of The Guardian. Welcome all. Maria, I'm going to start with this caravan, as it's being called, because President Trump has really fixated on this few hundred people that have been coming up. What's their plight? What are they trying to say? Because this has been going on for a while, right? It's not the first year.
Well, the first, first of all, it's been going on for at least a decade, and it was always meant to highlight the fact that under international law, there are protections for vulnerable populations seeking for instance, the right to seek asylum in the U.S. So they've been doing it for quite a while, for at least a decade. This time around, what's different is that, Fox and Friends got wind of it.
Sorry, that's Donald Trump's favorite breakfast table show for our international audience.
That's where he gets all his information from, and obviously it's information that has a heavy conservative slant without the proper context, of course. And so he was alarmed. He saw these people being, getting ready to invade America. And so he figured, okay, American immigration laws are the laughingstock of the world. We have to do something about this. He's been at it for quite some time now, trying to. It's interesting that he's calling those legal protections for minors, for instance, he's calling them legal loopholes, where in fact these are. Yeah, these are legal protections adopted by the U.S. Congress, also looked under international law to protect the minors. So when they arrived, the caravan started on March 25th from the Mexico's southern border. Obviously, under a lot of political pressure, Mexico detained some of them, and a lot of them were given humanitarian relief in Mexico. A lot of them were deported. And then you have a very small group between 150 and 200 that finally made it to the U.S. southern border. And, they got here over the weekend, and only 8 people have been processed for asylum thus far.
Thanks. Obviously, they're getting a lot of publicity from Donald Trump. Before I get to you, Morgan, I want to play the U.S. president and his reaction to what's going on at the border.
We have to have borders, and we have to have them fast. And we need security. We need the wall. We're going to have it all. And again, that wall has started. We got $1.6 billion. We come up again on September 28th. And if we don't get border security, we'll have no choice. We'll close down the country.
Morgan, why is the president so fixated on this caravan? We saw kids there, and it's not exactly the MS-13 gun-toting rapist that he's talked about.
Well, I certainly hope that's the case, but I will say that the purpose of this caravan is obviously to attract attention from the media. This is the purpose of why they do this, to make these symbolic events that put the American government in an awkward position of having to deal with folks who are basically just walking up to the wall and demanding entrance. Why? Because they have claims that may or may not be verifiable that they come from areas of high violence. But I do think it's ironic that in the other guests' point about what happened to them when they went through Mexico, and she said sort of something to the effect of under political pressure. But Mexico has almost draconian immigration laws.
So do you think the U.S. should adopt Mexican laws?
No, I just think that oftentimes when we make these false moral equivalences, that America is the only country that's not allowed to have any sort of reasonably strict laws on our borders. Every other country that often has far more restrictive rules and laws gets a pass, and it's never, ever talked about. So I think it's a much more reasonable, if you're talking about it from a philosophical point of view, is to really keep in mind where America is in the world. And we don't have floods of Americans or Canadians going into the Mexican border, but there are Central Americans desperately trying to come through the southern border of Mexico, and Mexico treats them without kid gloves far worse than anything you're seeing in the American southern border now. So I just think it's an important point.
But there's a big difference, though. America is supposed to be a beacon of democracy, respect for due process. I mean, I think that what's wrong with the argument is the false argument that's being made a lot of times is that, you know, people who are for refugee rights are necessarily for open borders, and that's just not the case. And we gotta remind ourselves that the U.S. is signatory to a lot of international treaties that demand protections for people. This is the situation. I come across the border. I have a family, you know, unaccompanied minors or, you know, minor children. No one's saying that the U.S. is under any obligation to grant every single person asylum. But what it is happening is that they have a right to apply for asylum. Let the officers determine. Let the process play out, and then if the agents determine that they don't have a valid claim, then of course they get deported, which is what's happening already.
Sounds great then. So what's the problem?
The problem is that you have these arguments from the administration equating all undocumented immigrants as criminals, and that's just not the case.
David, this must be echoing with you because there's a similar scandal happening in the UK right now, right? Can I ask you a wider question? Is that when governments decide they want to get stricter about immigration policy, sometimes they find themselves actually excluding the very people that they should be let in?
Yes, it can be very counterproductive that way. And as you refer to, in the UK, a major scandal over the Windrush generation who came to Britain after the war and didn't have proper documentation. And it's come out in recent days that the British government tried to create, quote, a really hostile environment for them, and the Home Secretary had to resign. And there have been many apologies about sort of recognising their contribution to British society. In the US, I think when Donald Trump was elected, there were certainly fears that precisely the kind of workers that America wants to attract might be excluded, thinking in terms of the tech sector in Silicon Valley and so on. I think what you're also seeing playing out right now is political pressure on Donald Trump from his right flank. The fact is he failed to secure anything like the funding required for the border wall in the last budget that was passed. He therefore really needs to turn up the fiery rhetoric about immigrants, about the wall, about keeping people out, just to really satisfy his conservative base and make sure they don't fully turn against him. And the bottom line always with this president, and we see it also with his attacks on the press, and we're about to find out with the Iran nuclear deal and in other areas, is his bark worse than his bite?
I'm so glad you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal, because that's where I'd like to go next, but in a way. We saw this week, Paolo, the confirmation and then the speedy exit from the United States of Mike Pompeo, the new Secretary of State. Quite incredible difference between perhaps his predecessor, Rex Tillerson, who apparently only like 1 or 2 meetings a day. He went to NATO and then he went to the Middle East. What's your view of this new Secretary of State and how he fits into everything?
Well, obviously he's an activist. That much we have ascertained. It seems like at the moment there's this sort of emergency mode of let's save ourselves from Iran and let's save Israel from Iran. This seems to be like the general idea. The Iranians are in Syria. There's possibility of direct confrontation. Some Iranians have been killed by Israeli missiles. We know that in Syria. So there he is, and trying to put together some kind of a framework also of discussion regarding the future of the Iran nuclear deal, and at the same time shoring up alliances with the Sunni Arab countries and trying to create a united front, a political front against Iran, which, if it's done well, may create that kind of pressure against Iran that may yield something politically in terms of any kind of renegotiation of the nuclear deal, which seems to be something afoot. I'm not quite sure if it's going to be successful or not, because it needs, there are many people sitting at that table, and so we'll see. But Pompeo, hit the ground running.
I mean, he was definitely running, but is he succeeding? I mean, he was running everywhere.
Success is a bit early to say.
Sure, but
he's been, what, a week on the job or something?
Okay. I'm actually going to play you a clip, not from the NATO summit, because I want to move on to Iran because we're talking about it, but from Mike Pompeo in Iran when he was in Tel Aviv with Benjamin Netanyahu.
We remain deeply concerned about Iran's dangerous escalation of threats to Israel and the region, and Iran's ambition to dominate the Middle East remains.
Now, this seemed a little choreographed to me, and I might be a cynical journalist, Morgan, but literally, he was in Tel Aviv, and then, like, a day later, Benjamin Netanyahu went on TV with a sort of show and tell, like a TED Talk sort of thing, where they got all these documents on, hang on a sec, on nuclear aspirations of Iran, but essentially, according to the IAEA, these were old documents, nothing new, but helped build the case for the US president and Mike Pompeo, as they've said they want to do, to pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal when they have to on May 12th. Was this a dog and pony show for that? A road show for selling that to the world?
Oh, maybe somewhere in between. I mean, I don't believe it's fair to call it a dog and pony. Was it choreographed? Of course. I mean, if it wasn't choreographed, I think people would have a lot of problems with the fact that you would just show up and the Israelis wouldn't notify the Americans that this was about to happen the next day.
Yeah, I mean, was it planned?
Yeah, I mean, probably. Yeah. But I would say there's something bigger going on right now than just the nuances or the minutia of this Iran deal. And that is, during the Obama years, the foreign policy of the United States specifically was designed to move America closer towards Iran. And under this administration, it's moving it more towards Saudi Arabia. So this is part of a much bigger shift in American views on the Middle East and what the pro-West, again, it's very much an open question what Saudi Arabia is doing, but for now the pro-West is someone that is antithetic to what Iran wants out of this.
Can I put this to you just to follow up? Because a lot of people think that this administration wants to get rid of the Iran nuclear deal because it stops them from their real policy against Iran, which is total confrontation. If you get rid of this nuclear deal, then you can confront Iran on all the other things they're talking about, bad behavior in the Middle East, its ballistic missiles, and if it starts enriching uranium, tackle it on that as well, almost heating up the atmosphere to create some sort of confrontation environment.
It's completely a fair question. Although I'll say, though, I don't think it's true. This is almost the exact same rhetoric was being used 6 months ago with North Korea. In fact, I was on one of the other programs on this network, and they accused me of having to defend the President Trump because they were worried he was about to preemptively nuke North Korea. I just don't think this is what this is for.
Well, one could also argue that there wasn't a deal in place with North Korea at the time.
Well, they had 100 deals in place, but they broke them all.
And I think I would agree with you in terms of a shift in foreign policy. Remember, President Obama came in saying that he was willing to talk to adversaries as long as it achieved a result for the U.S., always looking out for the interests of the U.S. And so now we have a president who's a lot more confrontational, who, despite his lack of political experience, he wants to show that he's a deal maker. We'll see whether or not that pans out with this Iranian deal, even though, the European Union, Angela Merkel was here in town the other day, basically telling him, don't do this, and we'll see what happens. But, it's all up in the air right now. It's 50-50. We'll see what happens and whether or not he's able to strike a deal.